This is Matthew, host of the Superhero Ethics Podcast, and I've got an ethical question for you. If I'm trying to help you not listen to ads, is it ethical for me to do an ad to help you do that? If you go to our website, theethicalpanda.com, and just click on the join button, for $5 a month, $55 a year, you get to hear all of our episodes without ads. Was I ethical in doing this? Let me know. Hello and welcome back to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Friends, we love to talk about the fact that ethical decisions are not made in a vacuum, that the context matters. Well, what if the context is existential? What if the context is about the literal end of all life on Earth? What ethical decisions become justified? What ethical choices should or can be made? And how do we live with that? These are the kind of questions asked by Project Hail Mary, and I am here with returning guest Becky Allen. Really excited to talk about this movie because the minute I walked out of the theaters and then picked up the book and went through that one as well, I thought to myself, there's so much here to discuss. We're probably going to do multiple episodes on this, to be honest. But in talking to Becky, I realized that they have been really excited about this movie as well. And so I'm really glad to be here. So Becky, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Yeah, I have not read the book yet. My library hold just came in, so I am excited. That's like going to be my weekend treat. But yeah, I saw the movie and I loved it. And when you happened to email me a day later, I knew I really wanted to talk about it.
Perfect. And I will just say that we're gonna, if you haven't seen the movie, we will kind of fill you in on enough of the discussion to follow along. But we're going to be giving away some very big things that happen, including one that is revealed towards the end of the movie that really affects everything that goes into it and all the ethical decision making that's happening. So if you haven't seen the movie, feel free to hit pause, go see it, come back. This will still be waiting for you because we will be having some pretty big spoilers. But before that, for just a second, Becky, it's been a little while since you've been on our podcast. Remind folks who you are.
Yeah, so my name is Becky. I am a writer. It's been a while since I've had anything come out, but I do have 2 young adult novels, Bound by Blood and Sand and Freed by Flame and Storm. They came out some time ago, but you can probably still find them if you try hard enough. I live in New York City, and I do, a lot of reading and writing, more than watching movies or TV these days, I think. But I did go see Project Hail Mary. I live with my sister, who is very excited about it. And so I'm really glad that I went to see that one.
Awesome. And we will have links to your books are still available for purchase online, right?
I believe so.
Okay.
We can double check that after.
Okay. Yeah, we'll double check. And if they are, then definitely I'll provide links to them in the show notes. So let me just give a quick summary of what the book is about and some of the choices and ethical decision making that's raised. And we'll go into more detail as we go. But basically, the conceit of the movie and if you've seen The Martian or read the book, it's very much like that in terms of it is positing a scientific possibility and then going into a lot of the science that would go into it. This is a bit more science fiction-y than The Martian is in terms of it does posit the existence of a number of different types of alien life, but a lot of the science is a big part of it, and scientific knowledge is an important part of how things get fixed, which is in itself an ethical decision in our world. So the idea of it is that the Earth is facing an existential crisis. There is this, what they discover is a life form that is feeding off of the energy of the sun, that is causing the energy that the sun gives off to decrease. And that this is going to cause massive climate and environmental change for the Earth that's going to lead to possibly full-on human extinction, but certainly a reduction of the resources and the living space that humanity has access to by a huge amount, leading to terrible wars, billions of people starving to death, dying in the wars that will result over the reduced resources, all sorts of things like that. And into that situation, basically a single scientist is given the power to make any and all decisions that are needed to deal with this crisis, and has to face, including sending people on what is clearly a suicide mission, a one-way mission to a different star, where for some reason this life form is not doing that thing to the star to try and figure things out. And again, our characters face the consequences of what does being under that kind of existential stakes mean and look like, and what decision making does that justify, and what decision making does it not justify. And so let's kind of start taking it from there. What kind of was your overall feeling on how this movie approached those questions?
I thought it was really interesting. So to get right to the big spoiler, because I think that that's really where the meat of the discussion is and what makes it so interesting. When the movie starts, the protagonist Grace has amnesia, and throughout the movie, he is remembering what happened on Earth that led him to be in this position on what is definitely a suicide mission, but will hopefully literally save the planet. And what he eventually remembers near the end of the movie is that he was not a volunteer. He was, unfortunately for him, knocked out and put into the coma that was needed for this transport, and was sent to go do this because he happened to be the only scientist alive who would be able to. And I thought that was a very interesting choice of saying, like, oh, when there are millions or billions of lives on the line, do you still have a choice? And he had made a choice. He had very explicitly said, no, I don't want to do this. And the scientist in charge of everything basically said, too bad, and sent him anyway. And I think I can probably be convinced otherwise, but I think that was probably the right call. I thought it was very interesting. She put it in terms of, this is actually because I believe in you so much. But it really was, is there any way to save the world? And if there is, then that is more important than this one person's life, even though this person is not willing to give it up himself.
Yeah. That person is named Eve Stratt. She's German in the movie. I think she's actually Finnish in the book. And it's interesting that they make her not only German, but someone who grew up in East Germany. And I think that's kind of the implication is that therefore she's kind of okay with some of the, authoritarianness, having grown up in that kind of a, for the greater good situation. And yeah, it's the way the story approaches this, I think, is so interesting because and I say you and I, we're both American, born and raised in the United States, although born and raised in New York City. Well, actually, are you from New York City?
I'm from upstate, but I've been in the city for 20 years now.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm a New Yorker.
Yeah, and I say that because there's always a sense of like, I'm not an American, I'm a New Yorker. But we're both part of the United States, we're part of New York. And those are cultures and communities where individual rights and individual liberties are really sacrosanct in a lot of ways. And I think for a good reason. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And this movie really pushes that to the outer edge, because I think if we had, in some ways, because there's two different ethical perspectives that are being started here, I think if we had started the movie knowing either of these two things, we would have felt very differently. Either if we had felt that the person who we were looking to as a heroic secondary character, Stratt, who is willing to do terrible things and hard decisions, but she's doing it for all the right reasons. If we had known from the beginning that she had sent a man to his death without his choice because she felt it was necessary for this larger mission, without all the buildup, I think we would have seen her very negatively. At the same time, if we had known that this guy was unwilling to sacrifice himself to save half, if not all, of literal humanity, the idea that we would ever see him like as a hero is almost impossible. How do you think it what does it do to these questions that we don't get to know that those were questions until almost the very end?
I mean, I do think that we find out sort of from Stratt's point of view a bit earlier, but I agree that makes it really interesting. I think just from a storytelling perspective, you're right. It is much harder to root for a character who ran away from what the movie certainly posits as his duty and the right thing to do. And I think as people living in the world, we also would want him to do that. And we're used to really narratives about her heroes and being heroic and being willing to go on the suicide mission. I think if I remember Armageddon from 25 years ago or whatever that was correctly, like the expectation of, oh, that's going to be a suicide mission, but we have to save the world.
Right.
I think it's really interesting to have a hero who does not respond that way. And I do think that by withholding that until the end, I mean, you get to see a lot of character growth on his part, which he doesn't know is growth. But I do think that it makes him a more interesting character, and it makes it a more interesting ethical dilemma to talk about, because we're used to the story of here's the hero who steps up and is willing to sacrifice everything to save an almost an unimaginable number of people, and he's just not.
Yeah.
But I do think she does say, not early in the movie, but maybe a little bit more than halfway through, he asks her, and I thought this was really interesting, like, it must be so hard for you. How can you stand sending people to their deaths, before he knows that he will be one of them? And she says, it's not that hard. And I thought that was fascinating. That made her such an interesting character to me.
Yeah. And it's something that the book goes into a little more detail in, but I think the movie definitely gives us enough that she is someone who, I think early on, accepts the monstrosity of what she's going to have to do. Because although this is the most extreme, there's a number of other things that she has to do along the way to make all this possible, in terms of marshaling resources of huge amounts of the world, and at some points doing harm to huge amounts of the world. And that's something that the book goes into goes into a lot greater detail about. For example, one thing that they talk about is, because since the literal danger is now global cooling instead of global warming, they need to actually kind of speed up global warming as a counterbalance. So among other things, they nuke Antarctica, and just like melt half of Antarctica as a way of dealing with, trying to warm the Earth more so that it cooling more will go slower. Because the whole idea is they're sending them on this mission. It's going to take 25 years basically until a result of it can happen, and they have to survive this time. And what it keeps coming back to, I think, for her, is that the result of not doing these things is so terrible that anything and everything can be justified against that one goal. That to me is such a scary idea, because I feel like that threat, that existential threat, is so often used in such a, once you accept that, then any evil is justified because of the opposite. How do you feel about the way that was presented in this, of, when we have that as a literal fear, that it makes it okay?
I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about sort of in comparison to authoritarian government, because authoritarian government is ultimately sort of suiting its own power, and that's its end goal. And I think what really makes this feel different, and it certainly feels different as a watcher, is that we know that her end goal is not her own power. Her end goal is literally saving the world. And so I think that it certainly can stand in contrast to a lot of supervillain type stories where you have the character who thinks that they're doing the right thing but is willing to sacrifice everything, and the including other people's lives, and the reader or the watcher understands that character is wrong. They're going about this wrong. Their goals are wrong. Like, that's not going to work. But the movie posits it in this case as this is actually the only way that they have. They presumably are trying other things, but it's a Hail Mary play to try to save the world from what will definitely be the end of humanity and, maybe all life. And so because, I think if you take what do we as the audience know out of it, then it is sort of just an evil authoritarian doing what she wants. But because we have the perspective of knowing what the story is, what the stakes are, and that she's right, it does not feel ethically as terrifying as when it's just a supervillain sending people to their deaths for their own ends. I think it helps that she is not doing it for her own power. We don't see anything about how she came to this position, why she was the one selected, but the movie never gives any indication that she is trying to gain something personally from this. It is only focused on she wants to save everyone. Right.
Yeah, I think that it makes that very clear, and I think that becomes very necessary, because when I think about this kind of thing, and I look at our own history, first of all, I think there is a long history of people claiming an existential threat where maybe they did actually believe it, maybe they just knew it wasn't there but just made it up as a way to control people. But either way, we can look back and know that the existential that is simply not true, and that's whether it's looking at the Holocaust, looking at the Crusades, looking at the concerns about undocumented people in this country today, like whatever that fear is, that's like, oh, but the fear is so bad, that means it's okay that our police or our ICE or our stormtroopers are doing terrible things. We know that none of these things are justified because the fear isn't real, and by this positing that, wait, no, and granted, in this there's no like labeling of it's one specific people's fault or anything like that, but by knowing that it's true, and I think you're right that because that by making it about how this is not for her personal aggrandizement, that it's not about her power base, that she's not trying to set herself up to rule afterwards, because I think one of the things that can happen so easily, sometimes it is someone who just wants the power. But also, I love talking the show about how villains always think they're the heroes. A person can get to a place where they think, I am doing what is right. I have to save humanity or my country or my whatever it is. And people challenging me are threatening that good goal that I have. And so I have to have all power, and I have to crush anybody who is challenging me because they're going to get in the way. And I kind of appreciate that the movie doesn't put that into this, but that part of the point is that she never gets to that point. She's able to keep herself in a place of, I know that I'm doing this for the right reasons, but it's not about me. It's not about it. When I'm challenged, I'm willing to listen to the challenge because I'm not afraid. I'm not so convinced that it has to be me doing this necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's actually sort of optimistic that there's this sense of like, I am focusing only on the greater good and it's not for me, and it is everybody coming together and has agreed to put me in this position. There's no sense that like it was a coup and she took over somehow. There are governments still acting and working together to make this mission a success. And so it is sort of a culmination of a lot of powers coming together to do what everybody agrees is necessary and the right thing. And the person who disagrees is unfortunately Ryland Grace, who gets, drugged and stuck in a spaceship.
Yeah.
It's sad for him, but important for the survival of literally millions and billions of people.
Right. And we'll get to him, I promise. I'm kind of doing the like dance of looking at everything else first along the way, but
I do think she's such an interesting character though, because we also there's no sense, there's no personal life for her. There's no sense of what led her here. It is so laser focused on what she is doing and her willingness to. And you do have the feeling if she were the scientist, she would get on the ship. She used volunteers when there were volunteers, and when there's an accident, which is, the other scientists are killed and leaves him as the only one, she will make that call, even though you don't feel like she's necessarily happy about it, or that she is presumably somewhat, sad. It's not what she would have wanted, but she is still willing to do it.
Right. And it's something that I really appreciate, because I often talk about kind of the low-hanging fruit of movie making. Like, I feel like it would have been very easy to give her a child, to give her a sentimental reason that she's like, I have to keep this person alive, or like something like that gives her an emotional investment of why she's willing to do all these things, or to show her more dealing with because like, yes, he is basically sentenced to death. Although again, we're dealing with huge spoilers. He winds up not dying because of technology being great. But he's not the first. Like, along the way, a lot of other terrible choices where it's like, in order to make this happen, we have to take these resources from this group and this thing, and other horrible people are going to be terribly hurt. And we see, like, at times Grace wants her to have some emotional outburst and to say, like, I'm so sad about these choices I have to make. And she basically acts as though that's not a luxury she can afford. And it's, again, that to me, that was so challenging, because I often feel like, science without empathy to me can get really scary. And utilitarianism, of the idea of, we do what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people, means you can do really terrible things to a small number of people, and that can lead to really bad places. I think I just liked it because it just keeps forcing us to challenge that and to say, in this kind of existential crisis, are there any lengths to which that we're willing to not let ourselves go?
Yeah. And one thing I think is interesting about what you said is like the idea of, oh, it would have been easy to give her a sympathetic reason, but they didn't. The other people who go on the crew do have that reason, and Grace develops that reason as he goes. That's part of the movie, and that's another piece of the climax is a big decision that he makes and why he makes it.
Right.
And I just think that's really interesting that they did not give that to the scientist, but we do see him develop that sense of, oh, now I have an emotional stake and I have to make a big sacrifice myself because of that emotional investment I have, which, so to get into the spoiler of that, if
please go ahead.
So at the end, so he's made friends with the world's cutest alien rock puppet spider.
Yep.
Rocky is amazing. I would die for Rocky. But he literally decides at the end, he and Rocky have successfully figured out what they need to do. They're going to go back to their respective homeworlds and save the day. And he realizes that there's been a problem. He fixes it for himself, but Rocky won't be able to fix it and will die alone in space. And so he sends what he needs to back to Earth, and then he goes after and rescues Rocky, even knowing that he will die.
Right.
And it's really interesting because that is not posited as a question of his ethics. He's literally now saving a second world, because if Rocky doesn't get back to Arid, Arid will be wiped out the same way Earth was going to be wiped out. That never even comes up. His only real question is, this is my friend. How do I protect my friend? Now I have an investment that I feel is worth dying for. And he does. And then, spoiler again, he doesn't die.
Yeah.
So, it is a happy ending. It is a very optimistic, like, warm and fuzzy movie. Like, it's really funny and really lighthearted. But it does have this very, like, ethical question at its core. But I do think it's interesting. Once that is introduced, it no longer, for him, is a question about the ethics of saving the world, either world at all. It's really becomes, I want to be the kind of person who will save my friend, even if it costs my life.
Right. Yeah, and there's, I think a thing that we discuss a lot is that it's a lot easier to be emotionally invested in a specific person than in an abstraction. When you talk about saving humanity, like, 8 billion people should matter a lot more to you than one friend. But one friend, one family member, one child, one parent, one lover, whatever it is, that's a much more real thing to hold on to. And it's also interesting, I think, because, and I want to dive into more in his character, and then we'll deal with the bigger question of how Stratt sends him. As we said at the beginning, he's revealed towards the end of the movie to have been a coward, and that he wasn't willing to make, and maybe even coward is a judgmental view I'm putting it on, because, but I think I am confident saying that, like, I think that I am willing to say that, like, yes, we lionize people who sacrifice themselves for their brother or stranger or whatever it is. I don't know if I'm necessarily that person, but I'd hope that when it's my life versus the lives of literally every other person on Earth, or even half of every person on Earth, that I would do that. And then I'm going to be pretty judgmental of someone who wasn't. He basically gets a second chance to face that. And as you said, he's willing to say, yes, I'm willing to give up my life to go after Rocky, and by therefore Rocky's people, but basically for Rocky. And in so doing, he faces again that choice that he knows that he failed the first time. And what do you think that says about Stratt's choice? Because to me, there's a kind of, what all this feels like is a kind of like, as you said, she says that she's doing this because she does believe in him, because she does believe that, like, if he could get over his fear, that he would go ahead and do this. And there are numerous times in the movie and in the book where he at later point accepts that he's going to die and is willing to say, you know what, I am willing to sacrifice myself, because he kind of has that self-knowledge of himself as a hero, because he's already like, well, I already made this choice. So clearly I'm the kind of person who can do that. I think I maybe kind of lost along the way here, but what my exact question is here. But like, how does that all factor into you're feeling that kind of like part of why he's able to make the decision to be a hero is because he believes he already was.
Yeah, I do find that so interesting. And like watching it, I've only seen it the once. And so going in, I didn't know that he had refused. So I was
Yeah.
waiting for the build up to him having to be the one who went. But I didn't realize that it was going to be, if you talk in hero's journeys terms, like that's that sheer rejection of the call. And then that's usually followed by the journey. And we've already seen the journey, but he did not go into it by choice, which it's just so interesting. But because he didn't know and we didn't know, we don't judge him as a coward, which I do think they play the scene very much for laughs, but they do also very much play it up as an act of cowardice. He like literally climbs a bookshelf and like runs away, and they have to like chase him across a field. Like, it's very silly, but it does make it clear that this is a man who understandably is afraid for his life, but less understandably from, an outside observer, is unwilling to do what everybody else agrees needs to be done and that he's the only one who can do. And I think that him not knowing that about himself, I think did enable him to be a braver person earlier on.
Yeah.
He certainly was afraid when Rocky first contacts him, but gets through it. And there are definitely moments throughout as he's working, he very stoically tells Rocky, oh, this is a one-way trip for me. I can't get back, but, that is what it is. And Rocky tells him that he's brave, and he clearly, like, that means something to him. And then Rocky says, oh, I'll give you some of my fuel so you can get back. And he realizes he might survive, and he starts crying, which is like, again, it's a funny moment, but it's also a very touching moment because it shows that he is at least in that moment, he has been a brave person. He believed himself to be, and so he became that. He has been doing the science and doing the work and was going to continue doing the work, even though he knew he was going to die. And he doesn't have that particular kind of breakdown until after he realizes that might not be the case. And it's a very humanizing, like, lovely moment.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into the biggest question here, and you started off by saying that you defend her decision, and I think I'm with you, but I admit it hits against the grain of so much of we have to give a person the chance to do the right thing, and I will say I walked out of the movie a little like feeling like it was a little contrived of the like it had to be him. And in the book, they go into a lot more detail about why it has to be. But I think, part of the point of the movie is like, it just doesn't have the chance to give you all the science, and you have to kind of go along with it. And that's okay. And so, accepting that he's the only choice for you, what is it that makes it okay for her to make this decision?
I mean, it's 4 billion people dying and one person being able to prevent it if he will. So, I mean, it's a trolley problem, but it's a very weighted trolley. Like it is a case where there is no the choice not to act is the choice for everyone to die, and so you literally have a choice between one guy and 4 billion people, and that doesn't feel good to say. Okay, it's the one guy, but if you accept that as the premise, which is what the premise of the movie is, then yeah, you're gonna choose the one guy. And I think what you said earlier about sort of the American individualism, like, but it's his right and he gets to choose not to, and that's, that is a very American point of view. I think a lot of the times that point of view is wrong. I mean, I think about like when there was the reactor meltdown in Japan, and a lot of people, it was like senior citizens were the ones who were staying to handle it because they felt like they were at a point in their lives where they could sacrifice for their community. And obviously it would still be a loss, but they were the ones who felt like they could do that. Like, I feel like that is sort of what we see as like the noble choice. And that's the kind of expectation that we would have of a standard sci-fi hero. So again, it's interesting that he didn't, but I can't fault Stratt for saying, gave you the chance, you didn't make the right choice, so now I'm going to make the choice for you. Yeah.
No, and I think very intentionally, as I said, she's European. She's presented as East German or German, but having grown up in East Germany in the movie, Finnish, I believe, or maybe Swiss in the book. But either way, I think it's clear that she's not American, that she doesn't have that. Because to me, there is very much a pendulum there of, I think a lot of the idea, in the Enlightenment and a lot of that philosophy of, the power and the importance of the individual comes at a time in world history when, for a lot of countries and a lot of governments and philosophies, sacrificing individuals for the name of the greater good is something that was very easily done, and individual liberties and rights not being seen as important. And I think, and I can look at some other cultures where I think it can be too communitarian, and there being real value to that. But I think this is not the first and won't be the last episode where we've talked about that the American focus on the individual above all gets deeply problematic and gets deeply harmful, and that there is, because I think that there's this feeling of part of why we see it as noble that a person is willing to sacrifice themselves like this is because we see it as because of course that it's their choice. And I think one thing that's really interesting is that the other people who are volunteering to go on this mission, they don't see it as that. That Grace is, even before he thinks about himself going, he's clearly kind of baffled that these other people would willingly send themselves on a suicide mission. And he asks a couple of them at various points during the story, either why are you doing this, or why are you not more upset about the fact that you're doing this? And I think the fact that none of them are American either has a big part in why the two who are most prominent, one is Chinese and one is Russian, that for them, it's not even as much that they don't see it as they're making this grand noble sacrifice. They have more of a sense of, it's for my community. It's for my world. Of course I'm going to do this. And the movie doesn't really explore that in depth, but I think that that's a real powerful statement of that if we keep that individual perspective up, we can see it as a great noble sacrifice, and that he's just not willing to make that. Or we can see it as, actually, no, there's the community owes a lot to the individual, but the individual owes a lot to the community. And it's not what that they're doing is noble. It's that Grace is failing in a fundamental aspect of, yeah, of course you're supposed to sacrifice yourself if it is literally for everybody else.
I mean, I think it can still be a noble thing to do, but I do think that the community focus is something which the American perspective often lacks. And I do think that it's also interesting that Grace is somebody who doesn't really have community. He is a teacher, and he does care about his students. We see there are letters from them. He carries around his hacky sack that he would use in class. I think that is the only real connection we see. We know he has an ex, but he doesn't seem to have any friends or family. I think Stratt literally says that as part of her justification for why he should make the choice to go, which he then does not make. And he lacks community, so he doesn't. So I think for him, it is seeing much more as this. Why are you sacrificing yourself in your own life? Whereas people with the deeper community roots and more community-oriented expectations of themselves, it is still a sacrifice. I think it takes away from it to say that it's not. But it is also more accepted that, yes, that is the thing that you do because you care about other people, and he's lacking that connection with many other people.
I think that's a great point. One thing I actually hadn't even really thought of until you brought it up like that. At the beginning of the movie, he's a middle school science teacher, and this is not in any way to put that down. There are, anyone who's willing to teach middle schoolers in general, by the way, is brave onto themselves. I've taught Sunday school to that age community, and it's really hard. And you can be they're incredibly brilliant people who that's what they choose to do. But the idea that one of the greatest scientists on this kind of study that is needed is doing that, if it raises some eyebrows, that's intentional, because part of his story is that he was a kind of young academic hotshot who had this theory that life could exist without water, and got treated really badly in his understanding by the academic community, and kind of snuck away with his tail between his legs, and thus is doing this. And I think that it's a subtle part of the story, but it's part of it is that he feels like the community that he wanted to be a part of has rejected him. And that probably is also a part of it, is that he has this fear of being rejected like that, and that may also be part of why he doesn't have that same sense of me for everyone else, because in his mind, like, he tried to put himself at risk and he got really smacked down for it.
I think there is that, although I think he also, and the movie doesn't spend a ton of time sort of on his before. I think he also was supposed to be represented as being kind of antisocial in that community, in that when he was told, I don't think that your theory is right, his response was very publicly, I think you're a waste of carbon. And, that might be part of why he had trouble finding a home in that particular community. But I do think that it is true that the lack of community, like, I can only imagine if you have put yourself through that much grad school that you are hoping and assuming that will become your community, and it very much did not for him.
Yeah, him not being in community, I'm not saying it's not necessarily his fault, but it definitely is a factor. Well, and let's take a bit of a wider picture here, because you talked about how this is a fundamentally hopeful movie. One of the things that I'm really struck by is, Stratt, as you said, she doesn't seize all this power. She doesn't like rise a mob or get into the military. We don't really see it happen, but the conceit is that all of the governments of the world have just sort of agreed, this is an existential threat. We need to deal with this. Here, have all this power. And for me, and I'm guessing for you and for a lot of people watching this movie, I couldn't help but think about that within not in our lifetimes, within like the last 5 years, our planet has faced not quite an existential threat, but still something that was a global pandemic that was could have probably become something that worse without a lot of the wonderful things that were done to intervene. But we didn't have a global consensus, and we certainly didn't have a national consensus in this country of, okay, let's let the scientists tell us what we need to do, and even if it's hard, we're going to do with it. We are still fighting about what precautions should have been taken then and should still be taken now, because it's by no means over. In many ways, to me, that felt almost like a fairy tale part of it. How did you feel about kind of watching in this movie the whole world come together and say, the scientists are telling us what to do, let's listen to the science?
Well, it's funny because I was nodding, but I thought you were going somewhere else with that. Because I was thinking about global warming, which I would say is an existential threat and is something where there has been there have been numerous attempts to get together and say, hey, let's listen to the scientists. And some of it has worked, and some countries have not, or have, gone up and down depending on who's in power. But that, to me, I was seeing it much more as like, I can't even say a global warming allegory because I don't think it's trying to tell a story about that. Mm-hmm. But I was seeing it as something much more along those lines of like, this is a threat that will lead to who knows how many millions of deaths if we don't do science about it. But the reason the movie feels hopeful to me is because they do science about it. Is because it is a story and we don't see it happen, but where you like in the Earth sections, you do have, the top scientists in the world coming together and having been empowered to do whatever it takes to save the world and save as many lives as possible. And then in the, story about Grace and Rocky, it's literally a story about saving the world with the power of friendship, because they need to work together and develop this very wonderful relationship between them, which Grace then is literally willing to die for. But they have to develop that and work together and pool their skills to be able to save both of their planets. And so to me, and then at the end, the planets are saved. Presumably many people have died in the interim, which the movie does not really dwell on. And I think that that's a fair choice for a movie because I think it wants to be a hopeful story. But at the end of the day, they do figure out how to stop the astrophage from destroying the sun. They do figure out how to prevent that from happening and prevent any additional further collapse that hasn't happened in the last 20 years. And that is very hopeful to me. And I like stories in which, even if it does not feel realistic in this moment that we are in necessarily politically, that are stories about people coming together and doing the right thing and figuring out what needs to happen and getting it done because it's the right thing to do for the world. That's really important to me. That's what draws me to speculative fiction, is not oh, the world is a drab place where only bad things are happening. It really is the sense of like, we could come together and make something better. And this is a story in which there is coming together and making things better.
Yeah. No, I think it's really true. And it's funny, you're right, that you thought I was talking about global warming and not the pandemic. And I think that is just as much, if not even a more powerful allegory. I think part of it's because when I was watching the movie, I was initially thinking, oh, an interesting way of talking about global warming by positing that's going to be about global cooling. And one of the things that I thought the movie was going to do is that, there's obviously a lot of politics in terms of how we talk about global warming. And that part of what's going into that is that a lot of the nations that are the most prosperous are not being affected as much and as quickly. And, we talk often about the global north and the global south, and the global south often is where the least resources are, but where the most effects of global warming are being faced. And, because where it's hottest is where it's going to get worse, and where, closest to sea level. And there's already being a lot of damage done to, people in Polynesia and like the island communities like that and things like that. Here in North America and a lot of Europe, we're not as affected as much, and we're not going to be for as long. The minute they talked about global cooling, one of my first thoughts was, oh, this is going to hit North America and Europe and Northern Asia a lot faster than it's going to hit the Caribbean and Africa and places like that. And that's a topic that the movie just doesn't engage in the slightest. And Andy Weir has said that he doesn't like science fiction, that his mind has an agenda, that he just wants to tell a good story. And I think that there's some, I want to push back a little bit and be like, no, but dude, every story has an agenda. And I think like your stories have much more of an agenda than you seem to think they do. But you're right. That I think that because this is really about kind of a hopeful story, I like that instead of sort of showing like how would the world actually react in a situation like this? This kind of being a like, no, but what if the world just did what it should do? That there's a real kind of like a lesson in that and a hope for that of why isn't this what we'd expect the whole world should do in the face of an existential threat? And what can we learn from that, since we are facing existential threat, just with the temperature going the other way?
Yeah. Yeah, and I do think the idea of who is affected is really interesting, because I do think about, you brought up the pandemic, and our response to the pandemic was not great, could have been worse. And I think the effects of the pandemic have caused a lot more chaos, directly and indirectly. But that vaccine came out real fast, for a vaccine. And I do think that has to do with the fact that it hit people who are usually very powerful. And it turns out that viruses don't care if you have a lot of money.
Yeah.
You will still get sick. And I think you're sort of positing, oh, it's hitting those people and they can't avoid it. And so that may be part of the backstory of how the world came together. And it may very well be. I think that makes a lot of sense. It does not feel like that needs to be explicit in the story, because it's not really what the story is about. But I do think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, definitely. And we kind of mentioned it briefly, but you kind of really harp on it. Like, one of the things that Stratt talks about a lot is that we don't actually know how much of humanity would live through this, but that it wouldn't just be people dying of cold and starvation. It's that there would be horrible war. If you have the same number of people and half the resources, people aren't necessarily going to just all get together and ration and share. There's going to be horrible fight. And she talks about how even those people who live, like, will there be nuclear war? Will civilization exist? And what just horrible traumas will they have to go through beyond just like, so that living isn't necessarily going to be the greatest thing either.
Yeah, and I do think that that's why it's important at the very end, in sort of the closing montage. From what my sister told me, because again, I haven't read the book yet, she says one of the only scenes that's really not in the book is there is a shot of Stratt sort of on a boat surrounded by ice, but receiving this data and presumably making use of it. And I think that that's really important to include as part of what makes it an optimistic story, is like, we don't know what's happened in the interim. We know it's, more time has passed for her than did for him, but we do see, oh, this was successful, and that he got what they needed and sent it back, and it's now going to be used. And was the whole goal. And so, we did it.
Yeah.
And I think that is a really important thing to include rather than leave ambiguous. And I'm very glad the movie did.
Yeah. And the book does give it, just in a much more much more at a distance, because again, big spoilers for the movie and the book. In the end, he winds up being on Rocky's planet and deciding to kind of stay on Rocky's planet. And in the epilogue scene in the movie is mostly him and Rocky kind of just being together and seeing what's happening, you know, and learning that he is still a teacher. He's just now teaching some of the people on Rocky's planet. In the book, what starts that is that Rocky comes to him and says, our scientists have seen that your son is doing okay again. You know, because part of it is that scientists on both of their planets had seen that these stars in this whole neighborhood of the galaxy were hurt, and so they could still study. And of course, because of light speed and they're 13 light years away, it takes 13 years to find that out. But yeah, so it's implied, but we don't get that, and we don't. And in the movie, in some ways, after you read the book, I'd love to have you back on, because there's a lot of discussion we can have about what the movie or the book shows, because. Again, also the book goes into a lot more detail about some of the other, really how many other awful choices. Like, among other things, the entire Sahara Desert is paved with solar panels. And it does horrible, things to Africa for a while, and horrible things to the environment. And when they talk about it, and they talk about this in the movie as well, that like the environmental changes that they have to bring about, many species are extincted and terrible things like that. But at the end of it, Africa has free power completely and totally. But also there's no Africans in the room when they make that discussion about should that happen or not. So that's just a difference between the book and the movie. And it's mentioned in the book, but in a much more we don't see that in a tangible way of like seeing someone on Earth in a situation where it's totally frozen over that shouldn't be frozen over, but she's getting information, she's learning what can happen, and we see that. So I want to close with one last question, and this might be a little bit out of right field, but something I've been thinking a lot, and you and I have talked a lot about gender and how that affects storytelling and stuff like that. How do you think it affects the story that Stratt is a woman? In terms of the person, because there's a part of me that wonders, would I be even more fearful of one person having that power and less willing to believe that they're not going to abuse it because Stratt's a woman?
I had not thought about that. I do think that is certainly plausible. I think most of the evil authoritarian dictators we see in fiction and, real life or whatever, are generally men. And so culturally, we certainly are taught to look at women as much more of that like community binding of like bringing people together and taking care of people. So even though I think it's interesting that Stratt is not shown as having that motivation or those connections, I could see that as part of it. I think on the flip side, it's really interesting that, Grace is a man, and that it is a story about a friendship between a man and an alien whose gender is irrelevant, but that there is certainly also a lot of cultural conversation about like male loneliness epidemic, and that Grace is a character who we know has no friends and no community, and it is a movie about him forming a very deep connection. And I think that is also a really important gendered aspect.
Yeah. And I'll say that Rocky isn't gendered in any way, but Grace, I think, uses he language to refer to him, and admits that that's a construct of an English language that he uses. But one of the conceits is that in order to communicate with each other, he teaches a computer, like they teach each other through his language, through math and science, and it's great. But basically, he creates a computer database of this is what all of Rocky's word sounds are, and here's the English word that they mean, and then just makes a computerized voice read it to him in English, and that voice is a masculine voice.
Yeah.
So I think, certainly it projects itself as two men forming this bond. And while fan fiction has had a great time with it, and there's nothing wrong with that at all, I don't think in the text itself it is definitely presented as a close, emotionally bonded friendship, not necessarily as romantic.
Yeah. Which I just think that that's also a really cool and important thing. I don't know that was something that was done, again, deliberately or for any political reasons. I sincerely doubt it would be. But I do think that is also having a male protagonist who cries several times in the movie, and who is very human with his emotions, and his emotions are very, he's not stoic at all. And he does have to form connection and find somebody who he loves enough to sacrifice himself for, to make the story work. And that's his character arc. Like, to me, that is, I think, equally as interesting as the choice for Stratt to be a woman and to have, you know, that kind of power, and to not show her having that kind of community. Like, I think those are just both really interesting choices that make the movie work really well, and that I'm sure did have, you know, some subconscious impact on me, whether or not they were intended to.
Yeah. No, I think that's incredibly true, especially because, you know, it's very weird how we gender the idea of sacrifice, because on a cultural level, we expect, and I don't mean to speak for you, but I believe we both identify as non-binary, so forgive the binary language of what I'm about to say, but that's how it's seen. You know, women are much more often expected to do a lot of sacrificing in ways that we don't talk about. And yet the nobility of sacrifice in a noble way, that's often seen as a very manly thing to do, you know? And then I think there's a sense of like, I think a lot of folks would, if you're still in that kind of mindset, his decision that he wouldn't is a very unmanly thing to do. You know, that a lot of the words that you use for him are probably gonna be references to female genitalia or things like that, or, you know, other feminizing words to describe him as not being brave enough to make this decision. So yeah, all the gender stuff that plays into there, it's subtle, but I think it's very important. And I'll just also add, and whether this is, you know, in the text or not is completely up to you. I think this is not a community I'm part of, but I think it's totally justified from the text. The fact that he mentions one X, but his romantic motivation is not a part of his story in any way. And in the book, that's even more the case. I know he's been claimed by the Arrow Ace community in a lot of ways, and I think that's totally awesome, you know, and that whether or not that was the intention of the author, I think seeing him that way is completely fine and makes total sense. And you know, that's a very underrepresented community. So if people see themselves in this character, I think that's awesome.
Agreed, definitely.
All right. We've been about an hour. There's been a great conversation. Any other last things you want to bring up, or questions from the movie you want to dive into?
Not really much questions about the movie. I would just say give it a watch. It is, you know, we've talked a lot about the deep ethical questions, which I do think are really valid, but it is also a really heartwarming story, and Rocky is a puppet. Like, there are a lot of practical effects in the movie in ways that make it feel much more kind of like a gritty old school sci-fi, but with a really like funny buddy comedy story at the heart. And so I just feel like it's a good watch, whether you're looking for something that's got a lot of like deep themes to explore, or whether you're just looking for something really fun that you can watch with your family. It's just a good movie.
Yeah, it really is. And I think you're right. There's very little CGI. There's no kind of AI creations and stuff like that, or it's very limited. I think that really adds to it. And I'll also just say, and I don't think I'm spoiling anything from The Martian. You know the general premise of The Martian, right?
Yeah.
I think if you ever watch that movie or read that book, that there's a further conversation there about how much this movie is in conversation with that, because the whole idea of that is, how much will the entire world come together to rescue one man? And this is about, you know, how much can one person sacrifice or be expected to sacrifice to save the whole world? And I think that's very much it. There's very much a mirror conversation there that's interesting to have.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, Becky, thank you so much. I agree with you that people should go see this movie. I don't have any way to get any money from that, but I'm going to put up links to if you want to read the book, because I think the book is fantastic. The audiobook is also incredibly well narrated. It's wonderful. The person who does the voice is just so good, to the point where apparently enough people had listened to the audiobook and so loved the audiobook version of Rocky's voice that they were mad that this voice of it in the movie itself wasn't closer to that. And I think you're going to get mad about that, but both voices are great. But yeah, links to all that will be in the show notes. And as I said, we're going to try and find ways to get Becky's stuff in the show notes. But beyond that, Becky, where can people find you and your work?
Yeah, people can find me on the internet on Blue Sky and on Instagram as allrep. You can visit my website, BeckyAllenBooks.com. And at that website, there's a newsletter sign up link, which I would love for folks to sign up. About once a month, I write kind of a short personal essay and I share a picture of some terrible ceramics that I've been making.
Awesome. The world needs more of these things. So thank you so much.
Bad art is still art.
Yeah, this is really true. And you don't get good art without making a lot of bad art along the way. So
exactly.
I'm a big believer of that. If you listen to some early episodes of this podcast, I don't know if this is art, but it's certainly a lot closer to it than it was. Well, thank you so much, Becky. We will have Becky back on for a number of things, but among other things, I know Becky's already interested in our What Made You Rebel Scum discussion, so we'll have them back for that and all sorts of other great things. So, myself, Becky, thank you so much for tuning in. May the force be with you.